Hello, my friends. The following is a long-form personal commentary on the current international situation with a particular focus on the war in Ukraine, Russia's role in that conflict, and the wider behavior of the United States and its allies around the world. It is not a news report, but an opinion piece that weaves together open source information, press articles, and historical references into a single narrative. Readers and listeners should understand that this analysis reflects one specific geopolitical perspective and uses strong, sometimes provocative language to challenge mainstream Western narratives about Russia, Ukraine, Venezuela, and other countries. I encourage anyone who follows this commentary to compare it with multiple sources, think critically, and draw their own conclusions about the events and actors discussed below. I will speak plainly. What we are watching in Ukraine is not some noble crusade for democracy, but the latest phase of a long-running Anglo-American project to weaken Russia, carve up its periphery, and terrorize any state that dares resist Washington's hegemony. And the methods used against Russia and Ukraine are exactly the same playbook we see applied in Venezuela and across Latin America. Sanctions, information warfare, weaponized human rights rhetoric, and the use of corrupt local puppets to give imperial aggression a fake moral cover. One of the big tactical surprises for Russia and Ukraine was Starlink. This Western satellite network has been the main operational backbone for Kyiv, not the Ukrainian army itself. Starlink has provided the communication grid for drones, guided long-range strikes into Russian territory, and enabled AI-assisted targeting and battlefield coordination. It is an American system being used in an American proxy war, and its role shows that the so-called Ukrainian resistance is functionally an extension of NATO C4 ISR, not an independent national force. Russia is now developing its own equivalents and ways to counter these systems, and China is doing the same. Chinese researchers simulating a scenario over an area the size of Taiwan have demonstrated that by deploying roughly 2,000 drones or other jamming platforms, they can disrupt Starlink coverage over a theater of war. That is a direct message to Washington that the days of uncontested satellite dominance are ending, and that the U.S. cannot assume it will always be able to blind its opponents and coordinate proxy wars at a distance. And here is the crucial link. The same imperial brain that uses Starlink and sanctions to crush Russia uses financial strangulation, media lies, and lawfare to crush Venezuela, Iran, or any other uncooperative state, then hides its own responsibility behind local puppets, just as it now tries to blame the strategic disaster in Ukraine on Zelensky and other juguetes rotos once they outlive their usefulness. The pattern is identical. First, they use the country as a battering ram against Russia or China. Then, when the project fails, they dump the blame on the proxy and walk away as if Washington and London had nothing to do with it. This is why it is absurd when the same U.S. establishment that has turned Ukraine into a depopulated battlefield and Russia into the most sanctioned country in history pretends to lecture the world about democracy and rule of law while at home. It cannot even keep its own capital stable. Look at the shooting near the White House in Washington, a live developing story with U.S. soldiers in critical condition, possibly dead, the suspect detained, but the details still unclear, and yet everyone already knows how this might be spun. Maybe a lone lunatic, maybe someone enraged at Trump's policies, or maybe this cannot be excluded in the American system, another false flag operation designed to blame left-wing extremists or communists and rally sympathy around a president whose approval is collapsing. The United States is perfectly capable of staging theatrics, including fake assassination attempts to boost a leader's popularity. Remember the suspicious incident where Trump supposedly survived an attack, complete with a dramatic wound to the ear, an episode that, on close inspection, looks entirely compatible with a small explosive device placed on his person rather than a sniper's bullet. Given that we already know Israeli intelligence has used remote detonated devices in pagers and other equipment, it is not hard to imagine a similar trick being used to build a myth around Trump as the man chosen by destiny who survived an attempt on his life. The same machine that lies like this at home also lies abroad. Washington dares to criticize Caracas or Moscow, while its own cities, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Texas, sink under violence, poverty, and decaying infrastructure. And while it spends billions on military deployments in the Caribbean and Eastern Europe, instead of healthcare and social services for its own citizens who, as everyone knows, can be ruined or mutilated by a simple medical bill. That same establishment uses useful idiots and fanatics, what I will bluntly call traitors and puppets in foreign states, to justify intervention. Look at Maria Corina Machado in Venezuela, whom I will call Maria Gorina in deference to the original Spanish rant. The New York Times itself, hardly a pro-Maduro outlet, admits that she has been spreading false claims about Nicolas Maduro, exaggerating threats and pushing the narrative that Venezuela is some unique menace that must be crushed by U.S. force. They even note that former U.S. diplomats and opposition critics worry she is deliberately promoting lies to trigger an intervention, just as Iraqi exiles were used to sell the invasion of Iraq with tales of weapons of mass destruction that Washington already knew did not exist. Once again, the empire later tries to pin responsibility on these opponents, claiming they misled us. But the decision for war is always made in Washington, not Caracas or Kyiv. In Venezuela's case, the same Times piece concedes that U.S. intelligence agencies and experts on drug trafficking in Latin America do not accept the fairy tale that Maduro personally runs some vast transnational narco cartel like the Cartel de los Soles, or that the Tren de Aragua is the global monster. The propaganda claims the so-called cartel often appears in their own language as more a label for general corruption and smuggling in parts of the armed forces rather than a coherent organization run from the presidential palace. Yet opposition figures such as Machado continue to insist, without proof, that Maduro is orchestrating global cocaine networks and even manipulating U.S. elections purely to win favor with Trump and the Republican hawks. It would be laughable if it were not so dangerous. The idea that Venezuela, struggling under crushing sanctions, is somehow rigging U.S. elections is obvious science fiction, as even another opposition figure, Enrique Capriles, has openly said. The same is true when these people claim Maduro has rigged elections in many countries, including the United States. This is propaganda so crude that it actually helps the resistance in Latin America, because it exposes the opposition as dishonest and servile. They are not patriots. They are pitianquis, little Yankees, local compradors, whose real target is their own people. These are the types who argue that bombarding their homeland is a form of liberation, who publicly state they would prefer a U.S. invasion to their own government, no matter the civilian cost, just as some now say they would rather see Ukraine destroyed than accept a neutral status that respects Russia's legitimate security concerns. The same colonial arrogance appears in the words of U.S. Congresswoman Maria Elvira Salazar, who recently boasted that Venezuelan women should welcome a U.S. invasion because American Marines are supposedly such desirable husbands, recalling how, she claims, Panamanian women asked Marines to marry them when the U.S. invaded Panama to kidnap Noriega. Beneath that grotesque statement lies the same racist colonial mindset that has always driven U.S. interventions. We march in, kill those we deem obstacles, and then improve the population by mixing with their women as if Latin America were a breeding ground rather than a group of sovereign nations. From the point of view of Russia or any serious anti-imperial analyst, these dynamics are all of a piece with what is happening in Ukraine. A corrupt elite cultivated by Washington and Brussels, is used to sacrifice its own population and territory in the service of a geopolitical project. When things go wrong, the West blames the puppet, not itself. We can see this with Zelensky already, as Western media begin to pivot from hero worship to discreet finger-pointing for the stalemate and losses. Exactly the same rhetorical shift is now being applied to Maria Corina Machado and other Latin American opposition figures. Even the Nobel Peace Prize has been dragged into this farce. On 10 December, in Oslo, a highly controversial ceremony is scheduled where the Nobel Committee intends to honor Maria Corina. Despite growing unease from Norway's own Human Rights Commissioner, who refuses to stage the traditional torchlight procession for the first time in more than 70 years, there is skepticism even within the system about giving a peace prize to someone whose entire political mission is to invite a foreign superpower to wage war on her own country. The guidelines and criteria of the Nobel clearly do not fit this award, and it is entirely legitimate to warn that this prize is rigged and weaponized. Yet, while criticizing the farce, one should also avoid cruelty for cruelty's sake. Once such figures are politically finished, there is wisdom in not humiliating them beyond measure. They are already, in a sense, broken toys. But that does not change the strategic fact. Washington uses them, discards them, and then pretends American hands are clean. The legal reality, as many international law experts now point out, is that U.S. attacks and covert operations in the Caribbean against Venezuela are illegal and can fairly be described as assassinations. The invasion of Iraq created a precedent that alarmed many jurists who warned that foreign opposition politicians might fabricate threats and humanitarian narratives to entice the U.S. into toppling regimes. And now the same dynamic is visible with Venezuela. In Iraq, millions died and were displaced on the basis of lies. The notion that Maduro's Venezuela is a uniquely murderous regime, while the United States, with its record in the Middle East, somehow occupies the moral high ground, is absurd. If Maduro is a killer because he has jailed CIA assets and coup plotters, then what do we call a country that has killed or displaced millions through sanctions, bombings, invasions, and proxy wars from Iraq to Libya to Syria to Donbass? Any honest accounting would put Washington in the dock long before Caracas or Moscow. The economic dimension of this war is equally important. Everyone understands that if Russia were to suffer a serious economic collapse today, the root cause would not be some intrinsic Russian incompetence, but Western sanctions and financial warfare. The US and EU openly say they want to devalue the ruble, freeze assets, and choke off Russia's energy exports. They brag about this strategy. So why is it so hard for the same people to admit that Venezuela's severe economic crisis was caused by similar measures, by sanctions, asset theft, and blockade, rather than by the mere fact that it is governed by a socialist project they dislike? Russia is a huge exporter, able to reroute energy flows via India, China, and others. Even so, sanctions have hurt. Venezuela, heavily dependent on oil sales to the U.S., and with far fewer options, was hit much harder, especially when key assets and gold were simply stolen by Western governments. To pretend that this is merely the failure of socialism is dishonesty, not analysis. When the empire squeezes a small country's economy, of course life becomes harder. That is the point. The same empire then offers relief if the government surrenders, a pattern seen from Chile under Allende to today's Russia and Venezuela. And just as Russia, with China and other partners, is slowly adapting and building an alternative order, Venezuela too has begun to climb out of the hole through cooperation with non-Western powers. That is precisely why Washington's henchmen are desperate to reignite destabilization there. In this context, Rumors and information warfare play a huge role. There has been talk pushed, for example, by Douglas McGregor, of Russian warships operating in the Caribbean. But when one checks carefully, there is no solid, verifiable evidence of significant Russian naval combat deployments in that theater. Right now, what clearly exists are Russian personnel and capabilities, including likely electronic warfare on Venezuelan territory, such as Isla de Aves, something acknowledged in both Russian and Western press. That alone is enough to unsettle U.S. planners and could help explain some of the mysterious signal interference in the region. But it is important to distinguish between well-grounded reports and Twitter fantasies. Some commentators, especially older ones, who trust anything they see on TV or social media, amplify weak claims because they fit their hopes. From the standpoint of psychological war, one can sometimes let such rumors circulate if they panic the enemy's proxies, but serious analysis must remain anchored in verifiable facts. The same goes for recent U.S. Air Force posturing. Washington published photos of B-52 bombers flying off the coast of Venezuela on 24 November, trying to project strength, yet those very images show the external pylons completely empty. The aircraft appear to have been flying without visible missiles. If you really intend to intimidate, you show the ordnance. If you approach another nation's airspace with weapons loaded, you also grant that nation a stronger self-defense justification should it decide to shoot you down. The fact that the U.S. chose to parade its bombers unarmed, or only with hidden internal stores at most, reveals its basic cowardice. They want the photo op without incurring the real risk that Venezuela, backed by Russia and others, might respond kinetically under the doctrine of legitimate defense. This speaks to a deeper truth. When confronted by serious resistance, whether Russian air defenses and hypersonic missiles, Chinese electronic warfare, or a politically mobilized Latin America, the United States prefers to fight through sanctions, proxies, and media hysteria rather than face a symmetrical fight. Look even at the internal politics of its satellites. In Spain, for example, the so-called Dericones, hard-right Atlanticists who parrot Washington's line on Israel and Ukraine, are continuously humiliated in Parliament by opponents who, whatever their flaws, at least recognize that blindly backing NATO's wars and U.S. coups from Gaza to Donbass to Caracas is not in the interest of their own people. These right-wing Atlanticists support increased NATO spending, unconditional backing for Kyiv, unconditional support for the Israeli onslaught on Gaza's children, and the Venezuelan opposition. They are, in that sense, the domestic equivalent of Maria Corina or Zelensky. And when they stumble and are mocked in public, it is not just a meme, it is a small symbol of the broader decay of the Atlantic narrative. All of this brings us back to Russia. Having Russia on the side of the global resistance alongside Iran, Hezbollah, parts of the Arab world, and a rising, increasingly assertive Latin America is a strategic asset for any country that wants to escape U.S. tutelage. Russia's resilience under sanctions, its military performance against NATO's proxies, and its willingness to openly defy Washington have given courage to many. Latin America has suffered the worst of U.S. interventions. CIA-backed coups, drug wars used as pretext for control, assassinations, death squads, IMF shock therapy. Now, for the first time in generations, there is a real possibility of a multipolar order in which Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, Caracas, and others can coordinate to resist dollar weaponization and Starlink-style techno-colonialism. That is exactly why the U.S. system is so hysterical about Ukraine and Venezuela at the same time. It fears that a Russian victory over NATO's proxy and a Venezuelan recovery from sanctions will together shatter the illusion of Western inevitability. And it is why anyone, be it Maria Corina Machado inviting Marines into Caracas, Zelensky demanding NATO boots in Donbass, or European and Latin American Dericonas, calling for more pressure and bombardment, who advocates surgical interventions or regime change operations today, is in moral terms a traitor to their own people, and in strategic terms, an asset of the same imperial machine that has already destroyed Iraq, Libya, Syria, and much of Ukraine. There has never been, in modern history, a U.S. intervention that cleanly removed a single leader and left the country intact and at peace. Panama, Iraq, Libya, and others are proof. To pretend that Venezuela or Russia would be treated differently is either ignorance or deliberate deceit. The task now, whether in Eastern Europe, Latin America, or the global South, is to stand in the first trench without waiting to see who wins and defend those states that are under attack, not because they are perfect, but because they have refused to kneel, and to expose relentlessly the lies and hypocrisies of an empire that kills abroad and decays at home while still lecturing others about democracy.